There is an animal sitting in your home right now that science cannot fully explain. It is not a wolf, reshaped by thousands of years of deliberate breeding. It was never truly domesticated in the way we typically use that word. It came to us, or perhaps more accurately, it came to our grain, and something happened in the space between wild and tame that no clean theory has ever entirely captured. For decades, the origin story of the domestic cat seemed settled. It seemed obvious, even. A small wild cat, somewhere in the ancient Near East, drawn in by the promise of mice, and gradually, softly, over millennia, becoming the creature that now occupies your couch. That story was elegant. It was tidy. And it was, as the genomic evidence has since revealed, far more complicated than anyone expected. Because when scientists began pulling ancient DNA from cat remains buried in graves, ceremonial sites, ships, Viking settlements, Egyptian temples, and Neolithic farming villages, the picture that emerged was not a single origin radiating outward. It was a series of waves. Overlapping layers. A history that stretched across thousands of years and thousands of miles, driven not by human intention, but by something far harder to contain. The question was never really, where did cats come from? The real question, the one ancient DNA is only beginning to answer, is, how many times did the wild become familiar? To understand why that question matters, you need to understand what we thought we knew. The domestic cat, Felis catus, is descended from a single subspecies of wildcat, Felis sylvestris libica, the Near Eastern or African wildcat. This much remains scientifically firm. Genetic studies published in the mid-2000s, particularly landmark research led by Carlos Driscoll and colleagues at the National Cancer Institute, compared the DNA of domestic cats from around the world to wild felid populations across 5 geographic regions. The result pointed clearly toward the Fertile Crescent, the arc of land stretching from modern-day Turkey through Syria, Iraq, and into the Levant, as the origin point of cat domestication. The timing made intuitive sense. Around 10,000 years ago, humans in this region made one of the most consequential transitions in all of human history, the shift from mobile hunter-gatherer societies to settled agricultural villages. They began storing grain. Grain attracted rodents. Rodents attracted wildcats. And wildcats, the thinking went, were tolerated and eventually welcomed for the pest control they provided. This was not an act of deliberate breeding the way dogs were shaped or cows were selected. Cats, researchers argued, were self-domesticated. They chose proximity. And humans let it happen. The theory even had a name, commensal domestication, a relationship built on mutual benefit, not on human control. It was a compelling origin myth. The cat as an opportunist. The cat as a creature that domesticated itself. But that story, tidy as it was, had cracks in it from the beginning. The first friction appeared not in genetics, but in archaeology. At a Neolithic site in Cyprus called Shilarokambos, excavated in the late 1990s and early 2000s, archaeologists uncovered the deliberate burial of a small wildcat alongside a human. The burial dated to approximately 9,500 years ago, making it the oldest known evidence of a close relationship between humans and cats, and pushing the timeline back even further than most models predicted. Cyprus had no indigenous wildcat population, which meant this animal had been deliberately transported to the island by humans. It wasn't wandering into a granary. It was carried across the sea. That complicated the passive narrative. If wildcats were being transported across open water at the dawn of the Neolithic period, the relationship between cats and people was not purely incidental. Something deliberate was happening, something we may not have the vocabulary to fully describe. Then there was Egypt. By the time of the New Kingdom, roughly 3,500 years ago, cats in Egypt had become deeply embedded in cultural and religious life. They were associated with the goddess Bat. They were mummified in enormous quantities. They appear in paintings, in jewelry, in coffins, as objects of profound symbolic meaning. Egyptian cats were tamer, more affectionate, more tolerant of human presence than their Near Eastern counterparts. Many researchers suggested that Egypt may have been a second, independent center of cat domestication, or at minimum, a place where taming went significantly further than it had anywhere else. But the precise relationship between Near Eastern cats and Egyptian cats, whether the Egyptians were working with the same lineage or a parallel one, remained frustratingly unclear. Two possible origin points. One, domestication, or two, the evidence was pointing in different directions, and without ancient DNA, there was no way to resolve it. Then came the genomes. Ancient DNA analysis, as a scientific field, transformed the study of human prehistory over the past 2 decades. But it also, quietly, transformed what we know about the animals that traveled with us. In 2017, a major study led by researchers at the University of Leuven in Belgium published in Nature Ecology and Evolution analyzed ancient cat remains from sites spanning the ancient world, from Neolithic Turkey to Viking Age Denmark to ancient Egypt. The sample included cat bones and teeth pulled from burial sites, archaeological middens, and excavated settlements, some dating back nearly 10,000 years. What they found was not a single domestication event cleanly spreading from one point on the map. They found two. The first wave emerged from the Near East, exactly as the earlier genetic models had suggested, carried by farming populations moving westward and northward into Europe and eastward into Central Asia. These cats tracked human agricultural expansion. Where farming went, cats followed. The genome of these animals bore the hallmark signatures of that Fertile Crescent origin. But a second, distinct wave emerged from Egypt. Sometime during the classical period, roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, Egyptian cat lineages began spreading across the ancient Mediterranean world. They showed up in port cities, in Roman-era settlements, aboard ancient ships. Researchers suggest these cats may have been valued specifically for their temperament, tamer, more socialized, more useful on long sea voyages where rodent control was a matter of survival. Egyptian cats, it appears, spread along trade routes. They hitched themselves to commerce the way their ancestors had hitched themselves to grain. Two domestication waves. Two populations. Both descending from the same ancestral wildcat, but shaped in different places, over different timescales, under different human pressures. That was not just a footnote. It was a restructuring of the entire origin narrative. If stories like this sit at the edge of what you thought you knew, subscribe, because the human past, and the history of the animals that lived it alongside us, is far stranger and deeper than any simple map can contain. But the story did not stop there. Because the ancient DNA also raised a question that the neat two-wave model still couldn't fully answer. When researchers looked at the genetic diversity present in ancient cat populations, particularly in the Near East and in North Africa, they found something unexpected. The diversity was high. Unusually high for what should have been the early stages of domestication. This suggested that the cat population that eventually gave rise to all modern domestic cats was not small, not isolated, not the product of a single founding event involving a handful of wildcats drawn to one farming village 10,000 years ago. It looked, instead, like a broad and sustained process. Multiple wildcat populations across a wide geographic zone, coming into contact with humans repeatedly over an extended period of time. Not a single spark of domestication, but something more like a slow, distributed warming. This means that what we call the domestic cat may be the product not of one human decision or even two, but of thousands of individual interactions between individual wildcats and individual humans, accumulating across generations, across villages, across valleys, until something new had emerged that had no precise starting point and no single founding ancestor. 3 explanatory frameworks have emerged from the evidence. The first is the classic Near Eastern origin: early, agricultural, gradual. The evidence for this is strong and well supported by both ancient DNA and archaeological finds across the Fertile Crescent. The second is a semi-independent Egyptian intensification, a second center where cats were not merely tolerated but selected, kept, and perhaps even intentionally bred for temperament. The Egyptian wave appears real in the ancient DNA. The degree to which it represents true independent domestication versus a more intense elaboration of an already tame lineage remains scientifically contested. The third framework, and the one that has gained traction as ancient DNA samples increase, is that domestication was not a clean event at all, but an ongoing, fuzzy, geographically broad process in which wild and semi-domestic populations continued to interbreed for millennia. The boundary between wild and tame, for cats, may never have been sharp. It may still not be. The landmark evidence that shifted the field most dramatically came from a combination of two things: expanding the geographic and temporal range of ancient samples, and comparing ancient cat genomes against both modern domestic cats and modern wildcat populations across Africa and Eurasia. What that comparison revealed was a pattern of persistent gene flow. Unlike dogs, which show clear genetic divergence from their wolf ancestors relatively early in the archaeological record, domestic cats continued exchanging genetic material with wild Libica populations for thousands of years. In some regions, this exchange appears to have continued well into the historical period. This means that the domestic cat carries within its genome the signatures not just of its first tamed ancestors, but of wild relatives it encountered across centuries and continents. The genome of your cat is not a closed archive. It is a living palimpsest, layer upon layer of wildness and familiarity, written and rewritten by encounters we will never directly observe. And then came the surprise that the initial models genuinely did not predict. When ancient DNA from sub-Saharan African cat populations was included in broader analysis panels, researchers found unexpected shared ancestry signals between certain ancient North African cat lineages and populations further south than the standard Egyptian model accounted for. The Near Eastern wildcat is the ancestral species that remains clear. But the geographic footprint of the process that produced the domestic cat appears to be wider, and the involvement of African wildcat populations more complex than the dominant narrative had room for. Not a single lineage. Not even two. The web. Think, for a moment, about what this means on a human scale. Somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, 10,000 years ago, a wildcat crouched at the edge of a village that had only recently stopped moving. The humans inside were learning how to stay in one place. They were learning what it meant to accumulate grain, tools, the beginnings of something that would eventually become civilization. And the cat watched the mice. What happened next was not a decision. It was not a breeding program. It was not a moment of domestication. It was something harder to name: a tolerance, a mutual investigation, a slow erosion of the distance between two kinds of creature that had, for millions of years, had no particular reason to be near each other. That process happened again in Egypt. It happened along trade routes in the ancient Mediterranean. It happened on Viking ships crossing the North Sea. It happened in ways and places the written record never captured, because no one was writing it down. The cats simply appeared, in graves, in temples, in port cities, carried by currents of human movement that were themselves only partially understood. Across mountain passes and river deltas. Across deserts and open sea. Carried in baskets, perhaps, or simply following the smell of grain and prey, the cat tracked humanity's restless expansion across the ancient world. And somewhere in all of that movement, all of that contact, something wild became something that chooses to sleep beside you. What does ancient DNA ultimately tell us about the origins of cats? It tells us that the story we had, the tidy Neolithic village story, the commensal origin, the single domestication event, was not wrong. But it was too small. It captured the beginning without capturing the width, the messiness, the ongoing negotiation between wild and domestic that characterized cat-human relations for thousands of years. It tells us that cats were not truly domesticated in the way we usually mean the word. They were not shaped by human selection the way a Labrador or a Holstein cow was shaped. They remain, genetically, astonishingly close to their wild ancestors. Researchers have noted that the genetic divergence between a domestic cat and a Near Eastern wildcat is among the smallest of any domesticated animal compared to its wild progenitor. The distance is real, but it is subtle. This is a creature that came to us on its own terms, and has never entirely surrendered them. It tells us that what we call domestication is not always a single event but sometimes a process, slow, distributed, shaped by ecology and trade and human migration, not by deliberate selection. And it tells us that the genome carries the evidence of that process even when the written record does not. The cat in your house is, in a sense, a summary of 10,000 years of human civilization. It followed the grain. It followed the ships. It followed the farmers and the traders and the soldiers and the explorers, spreading from the Fertile Crescent to Egypt to Rome to Scandinavia to the entire world, arriving not because we chose it, but because the world we built was one it could inhabit. And perhaps that is the deepest truth the ancient DNA reveals, not about cats but about domestication itself, that it is not always something we do to animals. Sometimes it is something that happens between us. A long, slow negotiation. A mutual accommodation. A shared history written not in language, but in behavior, in proximity, in the accumulated evidence of a genome that still carries the ghost of something wild. The story of where cats came from is still being written. New ancient DNA samples from Central Asia, from Sub-Saharan Africa, from sites along the ancient Silk Road are expanding the picture. Each new genome adds another layer. Each layer makes the map more complicated and more true. The answer, it turns out, was never a place. It was a process. And it is still unfolding. If you want more stories where the genome rewrites the history we thought we understood, subscribe. Because the archive encoded in ancient DNA is deeper than any library, and we are only beginning to read it.